The purpose of an invoice is to record that a sale has been consummated and then accounts receivable for the particular customer job has been created. If the sales represented a cash sale, then you would create a sales receipt transaction, which we cover in a later session. You can create a new invoice by either going to the customer drop-down menu or one of the icons available on the home page or icon taskbar. Also, the Customer Center provides you with a drop-down menu under New Transactions where you can select the Invoice function. Once you select Invoice under any of the choices mentioned, this is the window that opens up. As with other QuickBooks functions, the module that you are in will appear at the top of the screen. Although various fields can be populated, the only required fields are customer job name and selecting at least one item in the body of the invoice. All other fields are optional to populate. Notice on the top of the invoice form, there's a taskbar where you are provided with different tasks you can perform, including being able to find prior invoices by clicking on the back button, and if available, you can see subsequent invoices by clicking on the forward button. Also, buttons such as New, Save, Delete, Create Copy, Memorize, Mark as Pending, Print, Email, Attach File, and the ability to perform other functions that we cover later are available as well on the taskbar. So let's do a walkthrough in creating an invoice. First, let's select a customer job. In this case, we're going to create an invoice to build a new garage for Abigail Aardvark. Notice all of the name, address, and ship to information automatically populates on the form once the customer and her job is selected. The class we are going to assign is New Construction. Note that by selecting class here, QuickBooks will automatically assign the class selected to any of the items we add below in the body of the invoice. For your reference, in Lesson 3, under the Accounting Preference session, we discussed the need to activate the class function, and in Lesson 4, we discussed the class list, including creating classes and what their purposes are. Next, let's choose the template form we are going to use. Notice there are several choices available. You may want to look at the different forms by selecting one at a time and seeing what fields are made available to populate. We cover all the various forms and how to edit them in a later lesson covering customizing forms. But for this example invoice we are doing, let's select the Intuit Product Invoice template. The default date field would be either today's date or the date used on the last form created, depending on the preference selected in terms of default date settings in the General Preference section covered in Lesson 3. As with almost all default fields, you can change this information at the transaction level if you want. The invoice number will be based on adding 1 to the previous number used. You can put in any alphanumeric field you want if you want to change the sequence, but the next time you see the form, it will increment the invoice number by 1. Keep in mind that each form type, whether an invoice estimate, sales receipt, credit memo, statement, or purchase order, carry their own numbering sequence. The PO number field you may want to populate if your customer has given you a purchase order for what they are buying from you. If you don't receive a purchase order, then just leave it blank. The terms field can also be populated since an invoice automatically creates an accounts receivable for the customer job selected. The terms choices comes from the terms list, which is covered in Lesson 4. Also note, once terms are selected, the due date is automatically computed based on the terms definition created in the terms list. If you use sales representatives, then you can populate this field based on the options available in the rep list, which we also cover in Lesson 4. The ship date will be based on the invoice date you put in, but you can, of course, always change this if you want. The ship via field can be populated based on the drop-down list choices available. How to set up ship via list defaults is covered in Lesson 4. FOB stands for freight on board and represents from what point the customer pays the freight. Once all the header fields are populated to your satisfaction, then the body can be populated by selecting the appropriate item or items. Please note that QuickBooks does not allow you to create any kind of customer transaction without using items. The same is true for purchase orders. In effect, items represent the activities you perform in your business and provide you a way of tracking these activities throughout various reporting in QuickBooks, which we cover in later lessons. Let's start by selecting from the Item drop-down menu a service item called Blueprints. Notice the description, quantity, unit of measure, price each, class amount, and tax status are automatically populated once I select this item. That's because all of this information was determined when the item was set up. But bear in mind, any of these fields can be changed at the default or individual transaction level if considered necessary. We cover setting up and editing items in Lesson 4 in case you need a refresher on this. Now I'm going to select several other items to round out our invoice. On the bottom of the form, you can put in a customer message, which I can enter in manually, or I can select from the one of the predefined customer messages I created in the customer message list, which is covered in Lesson 4. Also, I can put in a memo on the bottom, and the customer tax code shows based on the default I selected when I set up the customer. Lastly, on this form, the default sales tax item or group is indicated whether drawn from the choice made when setting up the customer, or if no choice was made, then the global sales tax preference would be chosen. Note that no sales tax was calculated for this invoice since all the items in the body of the invoice were non-taxable items. If any of the items were taxable, the sales tax would have been calculated based on the item amount multiplied by the sales tax rate. Once completed, the invoice can then be saved by clicking on the bottom button or the top Save button. Once saved, the invoice is part of the customer's database and the transaction can be easily found in the Customer Center or several available reports for invoices.